Dr. Ananya Roy Pratihar is a researcher specializing in literature and in the environment and humanities. And she's a faculty member at the Institute of Management and Information Science. Among her co-editorships are two on Deleuze and Guattari with Sashwat Das, who spoke yesterday, one on schizoanalysis of the global pandemic and another on schizoanalysis of neoliberalism. And also perhaps of particular interest for today's participants is co-editor of Technology, Urban Space and Network Community. And she's also visited Germany in the past. She's taught seminar courses at the University of Oldenburg and Göttingen. And she's been working recently, particularly at the intersection of literature, culture and decolonial planetarity. And that's the topic of her masterclass today, focusing on the work of the marvelous Amitav Ghosh. So thank you very much, Ananya, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this introduction. Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to join you virtually for this MESH masterclass. And I'm sincerely thankful to Professor Kate Rigby and Dr. Christoph for this kind invitation. So here I begin my session. Before that, I would like to begin with a quote from Robert Macfarlane's very recent book, Is a River Alive? And I quote, "What all share is a recognition that we live in a polyphonic world, but also one in which the majority of Earth's inhabitants, human and other than human, are denied voice." Now, to be silenced is not the same as to be silent, or to go unheard is not the same as to be speechless. No landscape speaks with a single tongue, I unquote. So, well, Macfarlane's observation poses a challenge that lies at the very heart of today's session. If the earth is truly polyphonic, why do our histories remain overpoweringly so monologic? Why do rivers, these forests, oceans, animals, landscapes continue to appear, merely as the backdrop to human history rather than being a participant in it? These are the questions and these questions form the point of departure for today's masterclass that I have titled Place, Planetarity and More Than Human, Geo-Centered Ecologies in the Selected Fiction of Amitav Ghosh. And to guide our discussion, I have organized the lecture into three interconnected sections. Part one will be about framing the planetary crisis. Part two, Geo-Centered Ecologies, of course, place, memory, and materiality. And part three, reimagining planetary existence. Now, in the part one, framing the planetary crisis, here I begin with Amitav Ghosh's the two texts that I have taken, the very recent ones, The Nutmeg Curse and Ghost Eye, to explore how the climate crisis emerges not merely as an environmental issue, but as a planetary condition rooted in colonial histories, extractive modernity, and ecological transformation. So here I begin with a story. Imagine that we are in the early 17th century, in what seems like a remote corner of the world, the Banda Islands, which is, of course, now in the present day Indonesia, grew a single spice that Europe desired more than almost anything else, and that was nutmeg. At first glance, it appears to be a very ordinary story of global trade. But Amitav Ghosh asks us to look much more closely. The history of nutmeg is not simply the history of commerce. It is the history of conquest. It is the history of forced migration, massacre, ecological transformation, and the birth of what we call modern day capitalism. Entire communities were exterminated so that, that one commodity could be monopolized, right? So landscapes were reorganized, forests were cleared, and nature itself became something to be owned, to be extracted, and to be controlled. So Ghosh argues that this was not an isolated historical episode. It marked the beginning of, or I would say it marks the beginning of a way of imagining the earth as a storehouse of resources existing for human exploitation. And that, he suggests, is where the climate crisis truly begins. So as we move through today's session, we will see that Nutmeg's curse is not merely about a spice, but or a distant colonial past. It is also about how the past continues to shape our present planetary condition. This is the first story. Now I go to the second one. Unlike the Nutmeg's curse, the narrative, this particular narrative, Ghost Eye, does not simply move across, across centuries. It moves across lives. It takes us from Calcutta in 1969, Calcutta in India in 1969, to Brooklyn in New York in 2020, connecting two seemingly distant worlds through memory, migration, and ecological history. Now, those who have not gone through this story, I would just would like to tell this in a nutshell. The story begins with Varsha Gupta. She is a 3-year-old girl from a Marwadi family, and vegetarian Marwadi family. Now, who is a Marwadi family in India? It is a business class, of course. Most of them are more into business, and they settle in the north and western part of India, and they are vegetarian. When I say vegetarian, they do not allow fish or meat to enter, even onion and garlic, into their house. That's what the Marwadi, that's the unique thing about Marwadi family. Now, this 3-year-old girl who had never tasted fish suddenly begins demanding fish and recalling memories of a previous life in the Sundarbans. Her family consults Dr. Shoma Bose, a psychiatrist who investigates the case with both scientific curiosity and openness to phenomena beyond conventional rationality. Now, what appears to be a story of reincarnation gradually unfolds into something much more profound. Now, Varsha's extraordinary ability to recognize different species of fish in the story, and throughout the story, you will get to know so many different kinds of fishes. And Varsha, a 3-year-old girl, could recognize those different kinds. This suggests that the memory is not merely psychological. It is embodied and it is ecological. Her body remembers what science cannot explain. And then the story moves decades later in Brooklyn, where Dinu, Dr. Shoma's nephew, reconstructs Varsha's story with the help of his nephew Tipu, an environmental activist from the Sundarbans. Tipu possesses the mysterious ghost eye. So there is no ghost actually. It's a ghost eye because the eye is becoming blurred, the vision. And he says that it is an alternative mode of perception that allows him to see both the visible and the invisible. As he says, I quote from the text, "Ghost eyes can see two worlds. One is the ordinary one that everyone can see, but the other, that's just for us ghosts' I. At one level, Ghost Eye is a story of reincarnation, of course, but Ghosh is doing something much more significant. He asks how memory survives beyond individual lives, how ecological histories refuse to disappear, and how the past continues to uh, inhabit the present. What interests Ghosh, Amitav Ghosh, is not simply what human remembers, but here he want to say how the earth remembers. So the novel, I would say, also foregrounds indigenous and more than human ways of knowing, where humans, animals, rivers, spirits, and landscapes exist within a shared web of relationship. And so, and this is, I think, in doing so, Ghost Eye transforms climate fiction into a mediation on ecological memory, relational existence, and planetary interconnectedness. Now, you might ask that, so if the Nutmeg curse asks us to rethink the climate crisis through the history of colonial extraction, I think Ghost Eye asks us to rethink through memory, haunting, and the living relationship between humans and more than human world. Together, these two narratives open up what I call geo-centered ecologies. Now, I again move. Now, let us again return to this humble Nutmeg. At first glance, it seems almost impossible that a single spice could tell us anything significant about climate change, but that is precisely Amitav Ghosh's point. Now, nutmeg is never just a spice, as I said. It becomes a doorway, a portal through which we understand the making of the modern world. So, before this European intervention, these islands, not only Banda Islands, there are many islands, were not simply producing nutmeg or other spices. They were living ecological worlds where forests, volcanic soil, oceans, monsoon winds, and local communities existed in a long-standing relationship with one another. Nutmeg was part of that ecology. It was not separated from it. Then comes what I call, the encounter with the empire. Now, when the Portuguese and later the Dutch arrived, they did not simply discover a valuable spice. They brought with them a completely different way of seeing the world. The island itself was no longer understood as a living landscape. It became a resource. It became a property for the colonizer over here. So the nutmeg tree, which was a part of the ecology, was transformed into a commodity. Now, after that, what happens was extraction. Extraction becomes very much inevitable. Nutmeg enters the global trade networks, connecting the Banda Islands with Amsterdam, London, and the expanding commercial worlds. But notice that what is traveling is not merely a spice. What travels alongside it are the systems of finance, system of shipping, logistics, imperial law, monopoly, and military power. So what looks like a trade is actually the construction of global extractive system. And then, of course, we have a deeper one to think about the colonial, violence that actually came within it. To monopolize the nutmeg, the Dutch East India Company carried out one of the most brutal massacres in colonial history. Much of the indigenous Bandanese population was killed and displaced and enslaved. They were made enslaved labor. And then again, the enslaved laborers were borrowed from other different parts of the country to replace them. But Ghosh asks us to see something even deeper. The violence was directed not only at human beings, it was directed at an entire ecological world. Relationships between people, forests, animals, and the land were systematically destroyed. So, the next transformation, after when there was a big massacre like this, the next transformation was ecological. Diverse forests give way to monoculture plantations. Ecological complexity is replaced by standardization. Biodiversity becomes inefficiency because capitalism demands predictability, uniformity, and maximum productivity. So monoculture is not simply an agriculture technique, it is a colonial way of thinking about nature. And by this point, we are no longer talking only about the Banda Islands. We are witnessing the emergence of global capitalism itself. Wealth extracted from colonial landscapes becomes the foundation of European expansion, industrial development, and modern economic systems. This is why Ghosh refuses to treat capitalism and colonialism as separate histories. One grows directly out of the other. That's why he says. And this brings us to the present crisis, the climate crisis. We often think of the climate crisis as beginning with fossil fuels and industrialization, but Ghosh, through his novel, through this fiction, The Nutmeg Curse, asks us to look much further back. He suggests that today's planetary crisis is the historical continuity of the same extractive logic that first transformed places like Banda Islands into colonial plantations. So when we look at this diagram that I have put up over here, I would encourage you not to read it as simply as a sequence of historical events, but please read it as the genealogy of climate crisis. So it begins with a seed, it becomes an empire, it becomes a system, and eventually it becomes a planetary condition. And that's the reason why at the end of the why in the end of this slide I have written, from seed comes the system and then the planetary crisis. Okay, now I again move on to this ghost type. If the Nutmeg Curse asks us to rethink history, Ghost Eye asks us to rethink memory. At first glance, the novel appears to be a story about reincarnation. We move between, as I already mentioned, we move between Calcutta in 1969 and the Brooklyn in 2020. It's a very interesting to read. Somewhere we are sent back and then we are brought forward throughout the novel. Now, following two very distinctively distant timelines that gradually become very much intertwined. But I will suggest that reincarnation is not the central concern of the novel. Rather, as I said, Ghosh uses reincarnation as a literary agent, or I would say literary strategy to ask a much larger question. The question is, can landscapes remember? Can the ecological histories survive beyond individual lives? This is where Ghost Eye moves beyond the historical framework of the Nutmeg Curse. History tells us what happened. Memory asks us how those histories continue to inhabit the present. Now, the two timelines, they collapse conventional chronology. Past and present are no longer separated. Instead, they exist simultaneously, suggesting that ecological crises do not occur as isolated events but accumulate across generation. as the novel repeatedly demonstrates this, that climate change is not something that begins in the present. It is layered, recursive, and sedimented within places themselves. And then that brings us to the second stage, the reincarnation and the ghost eye vision. That's the most interesting part in this novel. Now, the ghost eye is often mistaken for a supernatural gift. I think it is much more interesting than that. It represents an alternative mode of perception. It seems visible, and it can see the visible and the invisible simultaneously, the material and the spectral, the present and the past, human histories and ecological histories. So in other words, I would say that the ghost eye becomes a metaphor for what climate awareness itself requires. The climate crisis cannot be understood through ordinary perception because most of its violence unfolds very slowly, invisibly, and across temporal scales that exceeds human experiences. So the ghost eye therefore becomes, I would say, an ecological way of seeing. And then memory, as I have already pointed out, memory as a living ecological archive, of course, because memory is embedded within the landscapes. And that's the reason why, Varsha, when she recalls her past life, she recalls where she used to live. She recalls the river by the side of the river, the bank of the river where she used to live. She could recall the trees, the mangroves, right? And here in the story, there is a fish who remembers. There are foods which work like, archives. Bodies remember. So when Varsha, recognizes fish she has never encountered in her past life, Amitav Ghosh is not simply constructing a mysterious psychological episode. I repeat, he is suggesting that ecological knowledge survives through embedded memory, connecting people to all kinds of ecological participants, like, participants of the ecology, like river, the species, and landscapes across generation. And then comes the question of indigenous ways of seeing and knowing. Yes, here Ghosh questions the limits of modern scientific rationality. Scientific knowledge remains important throughout the novel, right? But it is never sufficient. Somewhere down the line, there are references where it seems sometimes it looks very funny, or sometimes it's beyond any, it seems, out of logic. The novel continuously, places scientific explanation alongside the indigenous cosmologies, Buddhist traditions, ritual practices, and vernacular ecological knowledge. The point is not to reject science. The point is to show that ecological crisis exceed any, show that ecological crisis exceed any single epistemology. To understand a damaged planet, we require multiple ways of knowing. This is what I would call epistemological plurality, right? So climate change again takes us to this, and I come to the next point of mine, ecological crisis across generation. So Ghosh refuses this framework of thinking climate change is a future catastrophe. He doesn't believe in it. For him, climate change is already historical. Each generation inherits ecological damage produced by previous generation. The violence of extraction continues to circulate through rivers, through oceans, through forests, through species and commodities long after the original event has disappeared. So the novel therefore refuses the idea of environmental crisis as a singular event. Instead, ecological crisis becomes cumulative. Each generation remembers these crises very differently. yet each generation inherits the same damaged world. And finally, all these movements converge in what I describe as planetary consciousness. Planetary consciousness does not simply mean thinking globally. It means recognizing that humans are only one participant with much larger ecological within the much larger ecological assemblage. Agency is no longer exclusively human. Rivers possess the agency here in the story. Animals participate in history. Spiritual tradition preserve ecological memory. Landscape become active archives. Even memory itself exceeds the individual human subject. So I would say that, Ghosh redistributes agency across humans, animals, landscapes, these spiritual worlds, challenging the human-centered assumptions of conventional realism. And this is why I have again pointed out, I have put a bar over here saying that the story takes us from memory, from place, from perception to planetary awareness, because the movement of the novel is not from past to present. It is from remembering differently to seeing differently. And once our perception changes, our understanding of the planet changes as well. For Ghosh, ecological transformation begins not with technology or policy alone, but with a transformation of sensibility or transformation of perception itself. Now, before we move further, I would like to step back from the novels for a moment and return to one of Amitav Ghosh's most influential non-fiction, The Great Derangement. Now, why I say so? Because I think after he published Great Derangement, and whatever instructions he had given to the future authors who want to write climate fiction, I think he did his job through this Nutmeg Curse, Living Mountain, and The Ghost Eye. So the first question is, Ghosh asks a rather I would say it's a very unsettling question. If climate change is defining crisis of our century, why has literature, culture, and even our imagination struggled to confront it? His answer is that we lack scientific knowledge. I mean to say, his answer is not that we lack scientific knowledge. We know more about climate change today than before. The problem, Ghosh argues, is that our imagination has not caught up with our knowledge. Modernity has trained us to think of climate change as a technical problem, something to be measured through graphs, through temperature records, carbon emissions, and predictive models. These are undoubtedly very essential, of course, but they tell us what is happening. They rarely help us understand how we arrived here, or how we ought to rethink our relationship with Earth. And this is why I asked the question, is the climate crisis only environmental? Ghosh would say no. It is simultaneously several crises unfolding at once. It is a historical crisis. In The Great Derangement, Ghosh argues that the climate crisis cannot be separated from the histories that produce modernity itself. History is therefore not background, it is a constitutive of the present. It is a colonial crisis. Yes, it is a colonial crisis. One of Ghosh's recurring arguments is that the colonialism did not simply conquer territories, it transformed landscapes into resources. It recognized, or I would say it reorganized the rivers, forests, mountains, and oceans according to their demand, according to the demand of the time. nature became something which could be controlled so easily. And from there, it became the crisis of inequality. I think in both the Nutmeg curse and Ghosh, he always points out to this the events that have happened due to racism. He points out that Ghosh repeatedly reminds us that climate change is profoundly uneven, and this racial biases or the inequality uh, is persistent because of this. Those who have contributed least to the global emissions are often the ones who experience its most devastating consequences. So climate change is never only about ecology, it is equally about injustice. Yeah, and then it is a crisis of perception. This, I think, is the most original insight of the Great Derangement. Ghosh argues that modern realism, and more broadly speaking, modern rationality, has taught us to imagine nature as passive. The earth becomes background, weather becomes scenery, non-human beings become objects, but climate change shatters this assumption. Sudden floods, unpredictable cyclones, fires, forest fires, suddenly emerge as active forces within history. So nature is no longer the backdrop to human history. It has become one of its principal actors. The challenge, therefore, is not simply scientific. And that's the reason why I asked that, is it a crisis of memory? Yes, crisis of it is a crisis of memory. Modern societies often separate past from the present, but Ghost insists that ecological crises accumulate through time. Landscape retain the histories, communities inherit ecological transformation. The present is therefore, the present is saturated with forgotten histories that continue to shape planetary life. Memory, therefore, becomes ecological rather than merely personal. So what these two texts that I have taken want us to understand is that climate crisis is not simply a failure of environmental policy. I repeat, it is also a failure of imagination. Now, this is precisely what Ghosh's later works set out to accomplish. And if the Great Derangement, as I said, diagnoses the crisis of imagination, the Nutmeg curse traces its historical genealogy, while Ghost reimagines it through ecological memory and more than human perception. If you read them together, these works point toward what I call geo-centered ecology. So now let's move on to the second part of the lecture, where I begin these two texts into dialogue through conceptual framework. So within this framework in mind, let us now consider the relationship Ghosh established between colonial histories and the contemporary planetary crisis. I think I have actually, explained that, but still, here the first point argues that climate change cannot be understood as an isolated environmental event. Contemporary discussions frequently begin with, as I said, all the data that we get, then the extractivist actions like for extraction of fossil fuels and carbon emission or rising temperature. While these remain scientifically indispensable, they often obscure the much longer historical processes through which the present crisis has been produced. Now, Ghosh's intervention is to relocate the origins of climate change within the history of colonial expansion. Now, this naturally leads us to the second point concerning European colonialism. Colonialism was not simply the occupation of territories or the domination of the people. It is also involved the systematic reorganization of ecological worlds, and terraforming was one of the major action that was taken by the colonial powers, which laid the foundation of what we are facing nowadays. And that takes us to the third point, which introduces Rob Nixon's influential concept of slow violence. Unlike spectacular disasters that command immediate attention, slow violence unfolds gradually, often across generations. Deforestation, the soil degradation, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and the cumulative effects of industrial extraction rarely appear as dramatic events, yet this gradual transformation fundamentally reshape ecological systems over long periods of time. The climate crisis becomes visible only at a particular moment through wild forest fire, floods, cyclones, but these events represent the culmination of much longer histories of environmental violence. And that takes us to the fourth point, and which raises an important theoretical question concerning the Anthropocene. The concept has been enormously influential in demonstrating that humans have become a geological, or I would say geological force, or capable of altering planetary systems. Yet scholars such as Amitav Ghosh and they have expressed reservations about the universalizing implications of this framework. If climate change is described simply as the consequence of humanity, historical inequalities risks become obscured. Not all societies contributed equally to industrialization, colonial expansion, or carbon-intensive development. The language of the Anthropocene may therefore flatten profound historical differences by distributing responsibilities equally across humanity. Ghosh instead redirects attention towards the unequal histories through which colonialism, imperial expansion, and the capitalist extraction produced the present planetary condition. Now, this brings us to the final point, understanding the climate crisis as the afterlife of colonialism. And and this fundamentally transforms the way in which environmental degradation is interpreted. Colonialism did not conclude with political decolonization. Its extractive logics continue to shape contemporary economic systems as well, resource for frontiers, ecological governance, and patterns of environmental sustainability. So the planetary crisis is therefore not simply an environmental emergency. It is also the I would say it is also the continuing material expression of colonial modernity. Histories of dispossession, ecological exploitation, and imperial violence remain embedded within contemporary landscapes and continue to structure present ecological realities. From the perspective of geo-centered ecologies, the Earth is no longer understood as merely a physical terrain now, or environmental background. It emerges as a historical archive in which colonial encounters, ecological transformations, and planetary processes remain materially inscribed. Climate change consequently appears not as an isolated environmental phenomena anymore. Right. Now, I again go back to the two texts that I have taken. This is where my my main concern is all about. So what one realizes that climate, when I say that climate crisis cannot be understood simply as an environmental phenomena, here I would now return to these two texts. Why? With a very different question. Rather than reading the Nutmeg Curse and Ghost independently, if we read together, right, we read them together as two complementary responses to the same planetary problem. Can we do that? Although they differ in genre, of course, we can't call Nutmeg Curse as a fiction. It's a non-fiction. And of course, Ghost is a pure fiction. The narrative structure is completely different, and the thematic emphasis also differs. Both are, but where they actually come together or where they seem similar, both are concerned with common intellectual project. What's the project? The project is to reimagine the relationship between human, history, memory, and the earth. This is the platform where we can bring them together. Now see, the Nutmeg Curse approaches planetary crisis through history. It asks where crisis comes from. Its central concern is colonial extraction, the formation of global capitalism, and ecological restructuring of the earth under empire. But Ghost approaches the same crisis through memory. Instead of asking where the crisis originates, it asks how these histories continue to inhabit the narrative. Memory is no longer confined to a human subject. As I said, it circulates through the landscapes, through the ecological part, the active forces of the ecology, even through the food, even through the fish that is served on the plate. Right? So the novel therefore shifts the analytical emphasis from material history to what might be called as ecological memory. So, this distinction between history and memory is crucial. History enables us to reconstruct the origins of planetary crisis, and memory enables us to understand its persistence. And now, memory reveals the ecological afterlives. One reconstructs the genealogy of the crisis. The other examines its continuing presence within the contemporary world. If we now turn to the diagram that I have it on my right, we can see how these two trajectories begin to converge. On one side, we have history leads to understanding of colonial extraction. On the other, memory leads to an understanding of ecological haunting. These are not parallel arguments, of course, and they are operating entirely independently of one another, but they intersect at a point of what we now recognize as planetary crisis. This convergence, I would argue, requires a different conceptual vocabulary. Neither colonial history alone nor ecological memory alone is sufficient to explain the complexity of the planetary condition. The climate crisis emerges precisely through the intersection of these two dimensions. It is simultaneously historical and ecological, material and effective, political and more than human. It is here where I introduce the concept geo-centered ecologies. I use this term to describe a mode of reading that places the earth itself at the center of analysis. As I mentioned earlier, Geo-Centered Ecologies examines how places function simultaneously as historical archives, ecological memories, and active sites functions simultaneously, active sites where these colonial histories, material transformations, and more than human agencies interact. So in this sense, geocentered ecologies is not simply another framework within environmental humanities. It emerges from reading these two texts together. The Nutmeg curse contributes the historical dimension of planetary crisis, while, as I said, Ghosh contributes its ecological and ontological dimension. Now, I think at this point, I would I would like to move beyond this textual analysis and position Ghosh's work within a broader conversation in the environmental humanities. Let's see if I can do that. The model that I have framed here illustrates the conceptual framework that informs my reading. Rather than treating Chakrabarty, Haraway, Bennett, and Nixon as four independent theorists, what I did, I started seeing them as four complementary conversations that illuminate different dimensions of the planetary crisis. Each offers an important colonial history, each offers a very, I would say, conceptual insight into the relationship that I'm trying to establish between colonial history, ecological memory, materiality, and place that emerges in Ghosh's work. So let me briefly explain this four conversation. I would first like to start with Dipesh Chakrabarty, who reminds us that climate change forces us to think simultaneously about human history and planetary history. Ghosh's engagement with Chakrabarty begins here, but redirects this insight toward the colonial histories that produce the planetary condition. Ghosh demonstrates that planetary history cannot be understood apart from empire, extraction, and ecological transformation. So history therefore becomes the first pillar of this framework. Now the second conversation is with Donna Haraway. Haraway's work invites us to move beyond the modern separation of humans and nature by understanding the life through relationship, entanglements, and shared worlds. This relational perspective resonates strongly with Ghosh, where this river, the fish, the spirits, landscapes, and human exist within interconnected ecological framework, and all our participants, I must say that. So relationality therefore form the second pillar of geocentered ecologies. Third conversation is with Jane Bennett. Bennett's concept of vibrant matter challenges the assumption that material objects are passive. So Ghosh extends this insight by showing that landscapes are not only materially active, but also historically saturated. The Banda Islands, right? The Nutmeg itself, the coastlines, the rivers, and the oceans preserve the material traces of colonial transformation. So materiality thus becomes the third pillar of the framework. And then the fourth conversation is with Rob Nixon. As I have already mentioned him once, that his concept of slow violence draws attention to environmental destruction that unfolds gradually across generations. Ghosh similarly reveals that contemporary climate disasters cannot be separated from centuries of colonial extractions and ecological restructuring. Violence, therefore, is not episodic but cumulative, shaping what? Shaping both landscape and planetary futures. Now, what matters here is not simply the contribution of each individual thinker, but the way these perspectives converge. Chakrabarty expands our understanding of history, Haraway foregrounds relationality, Bennett rethinks materiality, and Nixon exposes the temporalities of environmental violence. Now, together, these four conversations move us beyond understanding climate change as merely an environmental issue. They invite us to see that the earth, to see the earth as simultaneously historical, relational, material, and political. It is precisely at the intersection of these four conceptual strands that I locate the concept of geo-centered ecologies. And I think that here, that's why, see, I have at the bottom of the slide, I have said that geo-centered ecologies, that's why it takes the central position, this is why I have said geo-centered ecologies in the center, in the middle of my diagram. It is intentional, of course. It does not replace these theoretical intervention, rather it brings all the voices together to develop a framework capable of explaining Ghosh's planetary imagination. And that's the reason why I have written here that reading the Nutmeg discourse and Ghosh tied together through geo-centered ecologies allows us to see that one text reconstructs the historical genealogy of the planetary crisis, while the other reveals its ecological memory and spectral afterlives. Okay. Now, this brings us to a more fundamental question. If geo-centered ecology emerges from the convergence of these theoretical conversations, what exactly lies at the center? My answer is place. Conventionally, place has been treated as a geographical location or the setting in which historical events occur. I propose that place should instead be understood as a geo-historical archive. Even, Ghosh, through his stories, even you can consider The Leaving Mountain, a fable, that the slimmest book that he had written. He has proved that landscapes are not passive containers of history. They preserve the material traces of colonial extraction, ecological transformation. So, and environmental violence. So history is not simply written in documents or preserved in institutional archives. It is sedimented within the forests, rivers, islands, coastlines, and geological formations. This perspective also allows us to rethink dominant narratives of Anthropocene. The Anthropocene has been invaluable in demonstrating that human activity has become a planetary force, but its universalizing language can obscure the uneven histories through which the planetary crises emerge. Geo-centered ecologies responds to this particular limitation by relocating the climate crisis within the historical specificity of place. Instead of asking how humanity transformed the earth in general, it asks which places were reshaped, which ecologies were reorganized, and which communities bore the consequences of colonial extraction and capitalist expansion. The planetary crisis, therefore, appears not as a universal human condition, but as I said, a cumulative outcome of historical unequal relationship between empire, ecology, and capital. Now, this framework also expands the very idea of archiving, archive, following Anne Laura Stoller's invitation to rethink colonial archives beyond official state documentation. Ghosh extends the archive into the material world itself. As you know, as he says, that plantation economies leave enduring ecological signatures upon the land. Coastlines record centuries of extraction and exploitation. Forests retain the traces of displacement and ecological transformation. These are archives that cannot always be read through written documents. They require us to interpret material landscape as repositories of historical knowledge. And finally, geocentered ecologies foreground the agency of place. Drawing upon relational ecology and new materialist thought, it refuses to understand landscape as passive backdrops to human history. Rivers redirect settlement. If you get the opportunity, please read Anita Rao's um, uh, India at the margin lands by Anita Rao, and you will get to know how river changes has changed the entire civilization. So it's there. Oceans facilitate and disrupt imperial expansion. Forests regenerate, disappear, and reshape human futures. Materials worlds are not inert objects awaiting human interpretation. They participate actively in historical and ecological processes. So climate change, I would say, therefore emerges here, as I said, not as an environmental condition, but the central proposition of geocentered ecologies then makes us believe, or I think convinces us, to see climate change as a historical and a political and ecological process inscribed within the earth itself. Now, my question here is, if place functions as an archive, then another question that I would like now to put: how does an archive remember? Unlike conventional archives, landscape do not preserve history through written records. They preserve history through what? Through material traces, ecological transformations, and more than human forms of continuity. Now, here I come to one of the most remarkable features of Amitav Ghosh's writings, and he all continuously, at least for the recent work, he has continuously highlighted this remarkable feature, that earth is never silent. Islands speak, seed carry history, rivers remember. Even spirits emerge from ecological worlds marked by unresolved pasts. This raises an important theoretical question: can matter itself become an archive of history? This is where Ghosh introduces the idea of storied materiality. Drawing on material criticism, particularly the work of Jovino and Opperman, here I use this concept to argue that Ghosh in his stories points out that matter is not passive. Landscape do not merely exist. They have a story to tell. Whether it is the past conquest, whether it is the violence, whether it is the terraformation, they remain materially inscribed within the earth long after historical events have passed. Ghosh explicitly critiques the Western Cartesian mindset that stripped the earth of its agency, transforming it into a passive repository of raw materials. Now, this becomes particularly evident in the Nutmeg's curse. The Banda Islands are not simply simply the setting of the narrative, nor is the nutmeg merely a spice. Both become forms of storied matter, preserving within their material existence the histories of colonial violence, forced displacement, plantation economies, and ecological transformation. And likewise, Ghost Eye expands the idea of storied materiality by showing that ecological memory is not confined to a single place. The Sundarbans, I think those of you have those of you do not know about this, it is one of the largest mangroves in the world, and it's in West Bengal, the eastern part of India. And it shares both the border of Bangladesh and India. So the Sundarbans, its rivers and the fish that once belonged exclusively to these tidal waters, but are now commercially bred in Brooklyn, in New York. Now, this kind of thing demonstrates how species carry histories across geographical boundaries. Their movement reflects not only ecological interconnectedness, but also the global networks of trade, extractions, and environmental transformation that shape the Anthropocene, right? So the spectral presence in the novel similarly suggests that what disappears from official history continues to appear or get circulated through this more than human worlds. Ultimately, storied materiality dissolves the conventional divide between the nature and the history. I would say here, from the perspective of Geo-Centered Ecologies, the Earth is not merely the stage on which history unfolds, it is one of the most enduring narrators. Now, if storied materiality explains how landscape preserve history, the next question becomes equally important. What kind of memory is embedded within these landscapes? I would say, is it simply historical memory, or does it exceed human altogether? I would say it is this movement from storied materiality to ecological memory and haunting. That brings us to the next dimension of the Ghosh's planetary imagination: hauntology and ecological memory. We have just seen that landscapes are, we have just discussed, rather I have just said that landscapes are not inert spaces, but material archives that preserves the traces of colonial violence and ecological transformation. The question that naturally would follow is, how do these histories continue to inhabit the present? This is where the concept of hauntology becomes particularly significant. Derrida argues that the past is never entirely past, right? Historical violence cannot simply be confined to archives or monuments, because unresolved histories continue to return, unsettling the present. Haunting, therefore, is not simply about ghosts. It is about the persistence of histories that refuse erasers. Ghost Eye extends this idea in a distinctly ecological direction. Rather than presenting haunting as a supernatural phenomena, Ghosh imagines it is a mode of ecological memory. The novel suggests that this colonial extraction, the environmental devastation, the political violence do not disappear once historical events are over. Rather, they continue to inhabit in rivers, oceans, and landscape. This is what I describe as spectral archives. Unlike written archives that preserve documents, or the geological historical archive that preserves material traces, the spectral archive preserves unfinished stories. And this is the reason why Amitav Ghosh came up with a fiction like Ghost, where there is a story of reincarnation and rebirth. Okay, these histories that continue to return because they have never received ecological or historical justice. One of the most, I would say, one of the most significant innovations in this novel is that it disperses memory and witnessing beyond the human. So conventionally, climate narratives rely upon human observers to testify to, ecological catastrophe. Ghost shifts this epistemological center. Here, the fish, river, spirits, the places become participants in witnessing the crisis and witnessing what's happening, and they work as an agency to help the human to enact critically, or enact properly, or to face the crisis. So ecological memory therefore is therefore no longer located exclusively within human consciousness. It is distributed across a network of human, non-human, and spectral agency. Seeing in this way, I would say that haunting is no longer simply the return of the dead. It becomes the return of the unresolved, as I said, unresolved ecological histories. Colonial extractions or environmental dispossession or planetary violence continue to inhabit the present because they remain embedded within the ecological worlds. The climate crisis therefore appears not as a singular environmental event, but as an ongoing historical condition whose afterlives persists across landscapes, across places, species, and generation. Now I arrive the final section, which asks how we might learn to inhabit differently, because I have already told you about the problem. Now, this part makes an attempt to explore a planetary imagination grounded in reciprocity, grounded in relationality, and ecological injustice that has taken place. Now, let us see if we can bring that planetary justice. Now, the discussion on hauntology leads us to even more fundamental questions, right? If ecological worlds can remember, can they also act, right? Can they speak? Why the humans have to speak on their fever? Can they do that? Now, this question takes us to the idea of more than human. One of the defining features of colonial modernity is the separation of nature from culture. Humans are positioned as rational subjects, while the non-human world is reduced to an object of knowledge, but of knowledge, management, and extraction. Now, forests become timber, rivers become transport routes, oceans become trade corridors, and animals become resources. Now, the agency in this framework belongs exclusively to human. Both Nutmeggers and Ghosh fundamentally challenge this anthropocentric worldview. Rather than presenting Earth as a passive stage upon which human history unfolds, Ghosh imagines a relational world in which humans, plants, rivers, animals, everyone can, stay in a interconnected zone and can reciprocate to one another. This is why the more than human in Ghosh is not simply a literary metaphor or symbolic device. It represents an ontological proposition, a different understanding of existence itself. Human life is always constituted through relationships with ecological worlds rather than existing apart from them. Now we can see this clearly in both the text. In the nutmeg curse, the nutmeg is not merely a spice, as I said, or a commodity. It becomes a material force. Even in the ghost eye, the fish doesn't remain just an object or something of food, but it carries memory, right? It held in one of the scenes, the snakehead, that fish remembers who was Dinu, the protagonist, in his previous birth. He was a otter. It sounds very funny that this Dinu, the protagonist of the novel, in the previous birth, he was a otter. He used to hunt fishes for a little girl, and now in this life he has become a human. Okay, fine, but this event was used by Ghosh in order to say that we remain interconnected in so many ways. Lives after lives, we are in. This is called the. I would say Ghosh's response is not a romantic turn to the nature. Instead, he proposes an alternative ecological ethic grounded in reciprocity, coexistence, and relationality. Indigenous ecological knowledge, vernacular practices, and more than human modes of perceptions all point towards ways of inhabiting the earth that reject the hierarchical logic of colonial modernity. Recognizing more than human agency, therefore, requires us to move beyond human exceptionalism. So humans are no longer imagined as the masters of the earth, but merely as a participant. Now, at this point, again, we come to find out whether this brings us to the final part of my argument, that geo-centered ecologies as a form of decolonial praxis. Here I come towards this, where planetary justice emerges through restoring relationship among humans, more than human worlds, and the histories embedded within the place. At this point, what we can ask is that even as we advocate a more than human ethics and a decolonial vision of the planet, are we still speaking through a fundamentally human voice? Can the non-human ever be represented? Or does every attempt inevitably translate it into human language or experience? I do not think Ghosh seeks to resolve this paradox. Rather, his fiction invites a different orientation. Instead of speaking for the non-human, it asks how human might learn to listen to landscapes, the rivers, the oceans, the animals, and the spectral worlds as active participants in planetary history. The emphasis shifts from representation to relation, from mastery to coexistence. This is where I locate geo-centered ecologies as a form of decolonial praxis. It is not simply an interpretive framework, but an ethical practice that reorients our relationship with the earth. As I said earlier, and I go on repeating this, climate change, according to Ghosh, is understood not merely as an environmental problem, but as the historical afterlife of colonial extraction, ecological disposition, and even uneven planetary histories. From this perspective, planetary justice cannot be reduced to conversation, technological innovations, or carbon mitigation alone. These remain incomplete unless they confront the colonial histories that transformed living landscapes into infrastructures of extractions and reduced the more than human world to a resource for imperial and capitalist expansion. Geo-centered ecologies therefore reconnects what colonial modernity systematically fragmented: history and ecology, memory and materiality, and and humans and the more than human world. It also challenges the universal language of the Anthropocene by insisting that a planetary crisis has been produced through unequal histories of empire, industrialization, and ecological violence. Justice, therefore, begins not with abstract notions of shared responsibility, but with the historical accountability. Ultimately, Geo-centered ecologies invites us to understand planetary justice as an ongoing practice of listening, remembering, and living with the more than human world rather than seeking to master it or represent it. Now I come to the end, towards the end of my presentation. So what emerges from both the Nutmeg curse and Ghost is that it appears as the historical afterlife of colonial extraction, ecological violence, and unequal transformation are something that all these memories are carried, are being carried with the participants of the planet. This is precisely where geo-centered ecologies offer a very different conceptual lens. Instead of approaching the planetary as an abstract global condition, it relocates climate within these historically situated places where ecology, places where memory, materiality, and history remain inseparably intertwined. The planetary is therefore understood not through abstractions, but through the specificity of landscape that continue to bear the traces of colonial modernity. The two texts arrive at this understanding through different but complementary trajectories. I repeat that the Nutmeg curse excavates the material histories of colonial expansion, revealing how a single spice becomes a portal into the interconnected histories of empire, capitalism, and planetary transformation. Ghost Eye, by contrast, demonstrate that these histories do not end with colonial past. They persist through ecological memory, spectral afterlives, and more than human forms of witnessing, and continually unsettle linear understanding of history. So as I conclude here, I would like to return to the question that framed this lecture: is the climate crisis only an environmental crisis? I would say that reading the Nutmeg curse alongside the Ghost Eye suggest that it is far more than that. The climate crisis is something which cannot be separated from history that produced it or the places that bear it. So by reading these two texts together, I have proposed Geo-Centered Ecologies as a framework that relocates the planetary within the specificity of place. It understands landscapes as archives, matters as storied, and memory as ecological, and more than human world as an active participant in shaping the planetary future. So ultimately, Ghosh's work, both the works, ask us to move beyond viewing the earth as a resource to be managed and toward understanding it as a living community of histories, memories, and relationship. Reimagining planetary existence, therefore, begins not by imagining a different planet, but by learning to inhabit this planet differently with historical awareness, ecological humility, and renewed commitment to justice. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Ananya. That was really terrific.